Okay, so we are back finishing up the 30,000 mile maintenance schedule for the Raptor, and I'm going to be doing a oil change and filter change for the transmission, as well as installing this PPE Transmission Pan in order to make future maintenance a lot easier because it actually has a drain on it. So I went ahead and opened it up. The PPE Pan, there are fancier options out there, but this fit the bill. It's not terribly expensive, and it met all of my requirements. It also has some cool cooling fins on it. But the main reason why I went with this is it seemed quality, and it was one of the cheaper options available. I saw a trick online. In order to avoid making a mess, you could put a screw in the bottom of the old pan, since you're going to throw it away anyway. And then when you pull the screw out, you'd be able to essentially make a little drain hole for the oil to drain out of. So I went ahead and found a spot that I thought was good, that I wouldn't hit anything, and put a hole in the old pan. While the oil's draining out, it's a good time to remove the heat shielding from the old transmission pan. Use a 10mm socket. It is going to have to be a deep socket just because of the studs that are on here. You're removing nuts in order to pull off those heat shields. I will say I did watch some DIYs where it said that you had to jack up the transfer case and the transmission in order to get to these rear bolts and actually pull the pan out. I wanted to prove them wrong. I was able to pull out the old pan by using a wrench. So you can use a 10mm wrench to get back behind there and unscrew everything. Ultimately, and you'll see this later on, it caused me a lot more problems because you can't get the new pan in without jacking up the transmission and transfer case. So just get that out of the way and do it to begin with, because it is very challenging. After I got the heat shields off, I went ahead and started loosening all of the bolts around the transmission pan. The studded bolts are 13mm. They need to be deep socket, obviously. And then the other bolts are all 8mm. I had also seen online that you needed to unbolt and remove the cooler lines that run to the front. The lines bolt in on the driver's side. I didn't do that. I was able to get the pan out, but again, in order to get the new pan in, I ended up loosening it anyway. Since it was taking so long for the oil to drain, I did use a step drill bit and drilled a larger hole, and that enabled the oil to drain faster also. So as you can see, I was able to remove the old pan without jacking up the transmission and transfer case and without removing the oil cooler lines. Again, this only works with the stock pan. So if you didn't drill a hole in the bottom of your old pan and you're going to reuse it, then you can do the service without jacking anything up. I did notice right here that I ended up scratching the surface of the valve just barely. It wasn't a big deal. It didn't cause any actual damage. To remove the filter, there are 2 bolts, one on either side, one on the driver, one on the passenger. I believe they're 8mm. They're either 8 or 10. Just go ahead and unscrew that. Let it drain a little bit more so you don't get covered in that very smelly oil. And whenever it's done draining, pull it out. There's no need to buy a new gasket for the pan. You can just reuse the old one as long as your vehicle's not too old. I do imagine that during my 60,000, I'm going to inspect to make sure that there aren't any issues and that I don't have to replace that. You can see there is a magnet both on the filter and on the old transmission pan, which allowed you to collect all of that friction material. I verified that the new filter was the correct part. You have to use the gasket from the old filter. I went ahead and threw it back on there. I did not replace it since I'm only at 30,000 miles. And then I went ahead with prepping everything, making sure it was clean. Since the vehicle's not that old, the surfaces were actually in really good shape. There were only a couple spots where I had to grab a Brillo pad and scrape it down in the corners on the back end. Next, I installed the new filter. The larger or longer bolt goes on the passenger side, shorter bolt goes on the driver's side. Tighten it down, install the old gasket, and then I came back and torqued down the filter. It's 96 inch-pounds or 8 foot-pounds if you have something that'll work. Here's where I realized that the new transmission pan won't fit because it's a lot thicker than the old one. So you do have to remove the transmission mount bolts completely. You can't just loosen them because of the angle that they're at. I thought maybe I could loosen them and then jack up the transfer case, but you can't. You have to completely remove them. And they're difficult to get to. The bolts are difficult to get to. I ended up spending a couple of hours doing this just because one of the bolts on the driver's side, the rear one, stripped out. I had to grab I think it was like a 9/16 socket, a smaller socket, and hammer it onto the bolt in order to get it off because the bolt is rubberized. It's completely coated in rubber and it stripped out the first time I tried to pull it off. So be careful and get this done first at the very beginning before you even pull the pan off. Here I am hammering the smaller socket onto the bolt in order to loosen it, and then I had to use a breaker bar once I actually got everything situated to completely loosen the bolt and then remove it. And despite all of that work, it still wouldn't fit because the exhaust pipe was in the way. So what I ended up doing was grabbing a ratchet strap with a block of wood, and I was able to tighten down the exhaust pipe to that cross member and get it out of the way. I still couldn't get it on. Again, I had to remove the transmission cooler piping. Just unbolt it, pull it off, and then you can move it out of the way so you can fit the pan on. Now that the pan's on, you can start tightening the bolts back in. I didn't buy replacement bolts, even for the studded ones. I just used the old ones that I had, and it doesn't really matter where you put them. I did not end up reusing the heat shielding, so I just tightened everything down and figured out where to put the studded bolts. So I just followed the directions from the PPE installation manual, which said 10 foot-pounds for the bolts. I believe it's actually supposed to be 8 foot-pounds for the smaller ones and then 10 for the studded bolts, but you can just do 10 all the way around. And then don't forget to tighten down the drain plug, which is 22 foot-pounds. Don't forget to reconnect the oil cooler lines. Mine barely came out and it wasn't a big deal, just to snug everything back up. Once you drop the transfer case and transmission again, make sure you tighten everything back down. It's just as difficult to get in there, and I just kind of made everything as tight as I could. Now for the fill portion, you are supposed to start with 5 quarts of the oil. Make sure that you're using the ULV, the ultra low viscosity, for the 10R80 transmission in the Raptors. I accidentally somehow bought the low viscosity, which is fantastic. Now I have a lot of extra oil to do the transfer case, but the actual transmission needs the ULV. So I bought 8 quarts of that. You start with 5, you warm up the transmission, you shift it through the gears, and then you just start checking it and filling up as necessary. Now, of course, you can't actually check the level unless the vehicle's running, so after you put the first 5 quarts in, start the vehicle. If you're using ForScan, get that set up so that you can check the temperature. If not, you can just use the temperature that's on the actual gauge cluster. So get it up to operating temperature. The goal for me was always to get it up to 190, I think. The actual temperature is supposed to be a lot higher, but I couldn't get it very high to begin with. If you're using a B&M Transmission Dipstick, I don't recommend it. Use the stock dipstick, but if you're using that, double, triple check, because a lot of oil comes up on the dipstick as you're pulling it through that hose, the stainless steel hose that runs back behind the engine. So it's very hard to tell the level. And I think it'd be a lot easier if you were just using the standard dipstick. After you pour more fluid into the transmission, give it some time to rest and cycle through it, especially if you're using the B&M dipstick. Go slow, take your time with this. I ended up overfilling by about half a quart. I think I put 7 quarts in and I only needed 6.5. So take your time, because I had to pull fluid out. I ended up pumping it out, which involved disconnecting everything from the transmission and pumping it out by hand while the vehicle was running right next to the catalytic converter, because I didn't take my time. This was kind of a nightmare for me, this entire process. So I just wanted to get it done. It was late at night and I was trying to knock it out. The amount of fluid that I actually recovered from the transmission was about 5.5 quarts. Again, there's probably some in the filter, there was some that spilled out, there's obviously some on the exhaust pipe. So it's going to vary, but make sure that you're actually doing a good measure to get the correct amount of fluid inside the transmission. You don't want to overfill it. Overall, I'm happy with the new pan. I think it looks cool. I went with the raw, and hopefully it's going to help me with future oil changes. I do think that at my 60,000 mile maintenance, I probably will change the filter again, and I'll probably swap out the gasket as well, the actual pan gasket, and replace the filter seal, because I should have replaced that here, but I didn't order it and I got so delayed. The reason I had to get all of this done so quickly was because I was making a very long road trip and I wouldn't have all of my tools and capability of doing any of this maintenance at the new place that I was going to. So knocked it out, and you know, and everything is good to go. I hope this gave you an idea of how difficult it can be to do this, but maybe give you some confidence in doing it yourself also, so you know what can go wrong while switching out the pan and doing the service. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.